Yvonne Fuchs from Quilting Jet Girl. In modern quilting with minimalism, large graphic design, and predominant use of solid fabrics, precision piecing can make a great impact in your final quilting design. Today, I'm going to talk about some tips for precision piecing in hourglass unit blocks. So let's start by taking a look at what an hourglass block looks like. An hourglass block can also be called a quarter square triangle, and it can be noted and different as seen as having the same fabric opposite from one another in the final block situation. So when you're ready to create an hourglass block unit, the first thing you need to decide is what size your block needs to finish in your pieced quilt top, otherwise known as the finished block size. For the purposes of today's demonstration, I'm going to walk us through creating a 7-inch finished block that can be used to create this single burst mini quilt. So once I know that size, I add 1.5 inches. So a 7-inch finished block plus 1.5 inches is 8.5 inches. I will then cut 4 8.5-inch blocks, one for each color that's going to be in the finished hourglass block size. So I have 1 light fabric, 2 medium tone fabrics, and 1 dark fabric. The first piecing step to create an hourglass block will be to create half square triangles. So we will pair the fabrics together, right sides together, making sure that the two same fabrics are in different stacks. Then we will draw a line from corner to corner on the wrong side of the lighter of the two fabrics. From there, we're going to go to the sewing machine and sew our first scant 1/4 inch. When I'm sewing my hourglass block units, you can either pre-mark your 1/4 inch line or you can use your 1/4 inch piecing foot. But as I mentioned, a scant 1/4 inch will really help you in the piecing precision. So I'm just going to sew this first seam. So I've just sewn the first seam, but I have a sample here where both seams are already sewn. Once you have both of your seams sewn on your hourglass block units to create the hourglass blocks, then using a straight edge, cut along the marked diagonal line that you made, creating 2 hourglass block units. For precision piecing, let's talk about how we're going to press these seams. Typically, when I am piecing, I like to press my seams open. It's a personal choice, but I find that it creates less bulk in my finished projects and has allowed me to have precision in my finished block sizes. However, this is a case where I deviate from what I typically do. I'm going to press my seams toward the same fabric in both blocks. So you will note that we're taking 1 half square triangle block from each grouping that we made. So we have 1 with the light and medium tone and 1 with the dark and medium tone. And in both cases, we're going to press the seams toward the medium tone fabric. So first, I'm just going to spray with a smoothing spray. I like to press to set my seams, and then with the fabric that I want to press toward on top, I lift the flap up and press my seam open, or towards the side. And repeat. The next step for precision piecing in making your hourglass block units is going to be very similar to the first. It's going to appear that we're making another set of half square triangles, but this time we are going to pair together these 2 pressed open blocks. And with the seams pressed to the side, we will be able to nest our seams together. So we will be keeping the medium tone fabric on opposite sides of one another when we pair the fabrics together, right side together. You'll be able to feel the seams nest and lock together. Again, we will do the same step of marking a diagonal line from corner to corner on the lightest side, and then we're going to go to the sewing machine and talk about how to sew this seam together. In a very similar method, we're going to sew a scant 1/4 inch seam away from the marked diagonal line. But we want to make sure that we have the raw edge of the seam towards the presser foot. This will allow the seam to stay pressed and locked together as we sew our first seam. Then when we rotate the block, the seams will stay nice and nested together the second time. So as I'm sewing my seams, when I come up to the seam unit, sometimes the seam doesn't always stay pressing flat, so I just take a moment to pause and check what's going on with my seam as I'm coming up to it. Now, the final step to seeing these hourglass blocks is to cut on the diagonal, marked diagonal line, just like we did with the half square triangle blocks. And when we open the block, you can see that the points in the center look nicely pressed together. Let's talk about how we're going to press this seam open. I recommend for this step that instead of pressing to the side, we're going to press the seam open. So again, I'll use some smoothing spray. And press to set my seam. Then when I open the block, I like to use my fingers to guide the seam open, keeping my fingers in front of the iron a few inches. Creating a very crisp hourglass block unit. When it's time to square this block, we like to think again about the finished size that we want our block to be in the pieced quilt top. In this case, we want the finished size to be 7 inches, so we're going to trim the block to a 1/2 inch larger than that, or 7.5 inches square. So I'm going to grab my square ruler, and I'm going to make sure that the corners of 7.5 inches on the ruler grid fall all on the lines that we have sewn, the seam lines. So I'm going to take my time lining this up. Because keeping those points on those seams is another big tip for piecing precision when you sew your block together in your finished quilt top. Once I have it aligned the way I want, I simply cut on 2 sides of the unit. I'll rotate the block, realign, and make the final trim. Realigning is much easier because now I have 2 straight edges that I can line my 7.5 inch marks up on to make the final trim. It's that easy. If you want to make a mini quilt just like mine, what you will need are 2 hourglass block units trimmed to 7.5 inches, and 4 half square triangle blocks trimmed to 7.5 inches. You'll sew those blocks together to make a tiny mini quilt top, and then I added 2.5 inch borders to the side and top to bring up the mini quilt size to 18 by 25 inches. Let's review my top tips for piecing precision. I recommend sewing with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you are pressing your first half square triangle blocks, I press towards the same fabric so that your seams can nest together. And when you're sewing your scant 1/4 inch to create the hourglass blocks, make sure that the seam on your top half square triangle block is open towards the presser foot on your sewing machine. Then press the final seam open. And that's how you use precision piecing to make a quilt top.